Right. I think we're ready to start. It's 2 p.m. and it's Tuesday afternoon. Michelle, could you tell us a bit about yourself before you start your talk?
Sure. So my name is Michelle DiMeo. I work at the Science History Institute in Philadelphia. I am the Vice President of Collections and Programs, as well as the Arnold Thackeray Director of the Othmer Library here. The Science History Institute is used to be the Chemical Heritage Foundation, which might be how some of you on this call know about us. We are a museum, library, archives, center for oral history, and we hold the largest fellowship program in the history of science in the United States. Okay. So in my role, I get to oversee all of these exciting programs, but I'm originally not from Philadelphia. I actually did my PhD at the University of Warwick in England. Was out there for 7 years. Came to Philadelphia and worked in a variety of, I was first a fellow here and then worked on the digital collections before I became library director and then VP. So it's very exciting being here. I get to see Boyle's portraits every day in the museum, which is not something everyone can say where they work.
Okay,
well, hi there, Paul.
We've got
how's everything going with you? Right, okay, yes, I tried to phone earlier on and I suspected you were out. Liz has been in contact with me. Okay,
Michelle, I'm going to have to mute you again. I don't know why that happened. Michelle, can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yes, I don't know what happened there, but anyway.
That's
Michelle,
all right.
Can you start your talk on who were women in chemistry in the 1600s? Far away.
Yes, let me adjust my screen just so I can see my notes. Okay. Well, I'll begin by saying thank you very much, Peter, for this invitation. I'm excited to speak with you all today. I hope you can all see my introductory slide here with the famous experiment on a bird in the air pump painting that many of you probably know. I'll start by saying it is slightly anachronistic. This is from the 1760s, of course, and my talk will be on the 1600s. But I have it here to set the scene since I know not everyone here is a historian, and I want to present this with the first artistic representation of the types of experiments that were conducted in the 17th and 18th centuries. This is a time of reproducible experiments. It's a time when we're talking about natural philosophy, which is a study of nature and the understanding of the forces at work in the world around us. But I think it's interesting too, if we look at this picture, the types of depictions that we see of how women interacted in these scenes at the time. If you look at this, you see women as bystanders. They're talking, they're maybe not interested, maybe they're scared, they don't like seeing the what's happening to the animals in the experiments. And we see it's very much a story of men who are leading this. And what I want to talk to you a little bit about today is that I think a lot of the history that we've been taught about where women were in chemistry in the 1700s or in the 1600s is not completely accurate. So I'm going to use two case studies to orientate you to two women who were in the 17th century and well known to their contemporaries in two very different ways. So I'll start by saying the talk today is going to be, like I said, a case study particularly. My focus is European science, but my emphasis will be on England in the 17th century. Now, intellectually, the 17th century was not a complete break from the medieval past. There were many ancient philosophies that were being tested and resituated within modern frameworks at this time. We're talking, the scientific revolution was a time roughly 1500 to 1700, but we're talking pre-Lavoisier, pre-Priestley. So why am I starting my talk in this time? Well, it was a time of novelty and discovery. Its colonization and trade was introducing new ingredients, new spices, new knowledge. There was a lot of knowledge transfer between the US, wasn't the US yet, the colonies. We have Harvard College was founded in 1636. William Penn, George Starkey, John Winthrop. There's a lot here. There's also travel to foreign countries where they start to go to the Barbados. There's slave trade. They're realizing that there's new ingredients. There's new ways that they can learn from other people. So this is happening at this time. It's also a time of many, many wars. This is just a sampling of some of the, sorry, my screen just changed. It's a sampling of some of the wars that were happening across the 17th century here. And as we know from historians talk often, wars can often be a time of change. It's a time when social norms sometimes break down. It's a time when we disseminate new knowledge, but it also allows for opportunities to people who may not have traditionally had a place in formal institutions at the time. And that leads me to my next point on this slide, which is not, let's see, advancing. There we go. It's a time of institutionalization. So this, across the 17th century, and especially in the latter half of the 17th century, we have the founding of all the major scientific institutions that really start to indicate the start of modern science. Gresham College was, of course, a precursor to the Royal Society. And then we have many institutions that start to receive monarchical or governmental funds across Europe. And it really creates a national presence for science. What I was saying is that this is a time, hopefully you saw me kind of walking through this, some of the different things that happen across the century we're discussing today, ending with the second half of the century is the founding of these major institutions that mostly excluded women. And so this is research that Londa Schiebinger did several years ago and talked about how the formalization of these institutions closed the door on women, that women were involved in science and chemistry before it became institutionalized in this way. And I don't entirely agree with that. I think it's more complicated than that, and that's something I'd like to talk a little bit about today. And the last point there I have is about the first professor of chemistry at the University of Cambridge. I have that here because I want to talk a little bit about chemistry as a discipline within the sciences at this time. It was a young science, and if you consider that the first professor of chemistry at Cambridge is in 1702, it doesn't seem that late perhaps, except when you think about the fact that Cambridge was founded in the 13th century and it took about 500 years. Because what we're talking about is chemistry was still seen in some ways as it wasn't a formalized discipline, and it had very practical applications that sometimes had feminine elements to it, in fact. And so what did they know about chemistry at the time? This is a very, very brief overview of what was happening in the 17th century, just to orientate you. But there's a lot of work happening at this time. It's a time when alchemy and chemistry overlapped. And if you look at the history between the 1600s and 1700s, it's often spelled chemistry, Chymistry, and that is because the word alchemy, chemistry, and chemistry were actually used interchangeably throughout this time. And I think increasingly it's taken, honestly, a couple of decades for historians of chemistry to really break down the fact that alchemy was not just a joke science. It was not something that we looked to and it was just about transmuting metals into gold and it was all really silly, which is what people thought for a very long time. And it's why the image that I showed you earlier with the actual experimentation from 1760 is the most accurate and respectful representation of this, is because most of the paintings at that time are actually kind of jokes of alchemists blowing things up and being secretive and having skulls. And I mean, it was still, there was a definite debate about the types of people who were just trying to make money off this, but actually a lot of real chemists were working towards this, and they used those experiments to discover things that we still use today. Phosphorus is one example that came from an alchemical experiment, and we know that Boyle and Newton and everyone was working through this at the time. And so so this is just an overview of where that is, and this is the field that we'll be talking about today. The idea behind alchemy was also that if they understood not that these that metals were elements, but that they were compounds, the thought was that you could separate them and maybe refine them and make them better. Or the idea behind the philosopher's stone, that there's a substance that could be added to a melted metal and transmuted into another. That might sound strange, but it was based on what they were seeing around them. So if you add a bit of rennet to milk, for instance, you can make cheese. So why wouldn't there be something that could do this? So this is some of the thought process that we have at the time. But the other important thing is that the 17th century was a time of experimenting and observing natural philosophy. Previously, a lot of science was done by reading books, by debating, and by trusting in the process of observing and not in the process of actually experimenting and making something of it and then reproducing that experiment and arguing for a truth. So that actual process of experimentation leading to new discoveries is specific to the 17th century. So who were some of the figures that we're looking at? The center there, Robert Boyle, is perhaps the most famous when you think of chemistry in the 17th century. He was known as the father of chemistry for a very long time until Michael Hunter's work, I think most recently, exposed the depth and breadth of Robert Boyle's life in natural philosophy more broadly. But he absolutely made perhaps the biggest contributions to chemistry in our time period that we're talking about today. His air pump experiments led to Boyle's law of gases. He's among one of the first fellows of the Royal Society and a major contributor to this developing experimental scientific method that I mentioned. But two others who were also, I think, contributors at the time. On the left, we have Descartes, a philosopher who articulated modes of inquiry that also helped us develop a scientific method that relied on experimentation. He also articulated theories about atoms and was recognized as a metaphysician whose theories really did advance science and medicine. And on the right there, I have Sir Isaac Newton. So of course, today we mostly know about Newton in terms of his work on universal gravitation, white light, and calculus, but he actually wrote over 1 million words on alchemy. And we have some of his manuscripts here at the Science History Institute as well. He was trying to identify the Philosopher's Stone, and he was working to advance knowledge on structures of matter. So these are the major figures. And so we wonder, why don't we hear about women at this time period? The assumption, of course, is that they weren't interested. They weren't doing this. It was a man's field. And this is what I want to talk more about for the rest of this talk, is that is not entirely true. So by the mid 17th century, as I said, chemistry is still a young discipline, and it's trying to define itself. It's trying to look more professional than it was perceived by some, because some did see it as a woman's discipline. And you can see here, this is 1713 here, the Queen's Royal Cookery. This is after my time period, but it shows you that there's still popular books coming out where chemistry and pastry are almost equated with each other. That's a woman who's doing distillation in her house. And it was common, something like rose water, for instance, could be used. A woman might make rose water and use it to flavor pastry, but she might also use it in a medical preparation. A lot of the overlap between kitchen physics and lady chemistry, there was a lot of gray area here at the time. Chemistry had a lot of practical benefits, not just for cookery, but also for agriculture and for medicine. So in some ways, it was seen as lacking some of the theoretical applications of some of the other natural philosophical subjects at the time. So Boyle himself and others considered a hierarchy amongst chemists. Boyle talks about vulgar chemists, and he distinguishes them from the chemical philosophers. He obviously identified as a chemical philosopher himself. And he really saw a distinction between those who did something like chemistry and pastry, or were maybe selling some of their wares in the market, as opposed to those who were really trying to discover the elements or the Philosopher's Stone and try to understand more specifically the theories and the nature behind some of the experiments that they were doing. And Boyle wasn't the only one. Skeptical Chemist is when he really goes into this, but there's also letters between others at this time. The one on the right that I have here, I don't know if you could see my cursor when I do this, but you could see here it references the art of lady chemistry. This is a letter that's exchanged from the Hartlib Circle, which is a precursor to the Royal Society. And we see here, again, just this reference to he calls it the vulgar art of lady chemistry. And so some feminist historians have kind of attacked some of this language in the past and have said, oh, these men were terrible with women, and they talk about it all being vulgar. That is not my read on this at all. Again, I think that this is a time when they're trying to elevate their own discipline, and vulgar, again, just meant common. It didn't mean the same type of the way we might use vulgar today. So there is an attempt to try to elevate this. But the fact is, this tells you, if nothing else, that women were doing this kind of work if these philosophers felt that they had to identify themselves as being against or different from this type of work. So let's talk about two women who practiced chemistry, but also engaged in some of the theoretical debates of chemistry. These are two very different women, and I want to talk about how they went about this, because I think the majority of the women who did practice chemistry were in that latter camp. They did most of the practical chemistry, domestic chemistry in the household, but we do have at least two women. I think there are actually more, but we have at least two women that lived both within the 17th century in England, shared similar intellectual circles, were part of the English nobility, and can talk more. We can use them as a case study to see how could women move up from that vulgar lady chemistry to this more natural philosophical status as a woman who's interested in chemistry. And there's basically two different pathways they could have done that. The left, the one I'll be talking about there, is Lady Ranelagh. This is Robert Boyle's older sister by 12 years, and with whom he lived for the latter part of his life. And on the right, we have Margaret Cavendish, the Duchess of Newcastle. Now, if you know of one woman in the history of 17th century science, it's probably her. She has a really big personality, and she published widely. She's now taught in undergraduate classrooms as well. And there are two very different ways to approach science at the time, is what I'll say. My work, and I'll talk more about this later, is on Lady Ranelagh, whose biography I published just a couple of years ago. So let's start first by talking about Margaret Cavendish, the Duchess of Newcastle. She has a modest childhood education. Most women were not educated significantly. If you had a big family, the boys would get the education. It just wasn't seen as being as important for the women. She is the second wife of William Cavendish, the Duke of Newcastle. He is himself an educated patron of the arts, and he loved the fact that his wife wrote, and he encouraged her to write, which is not something that I think happened in many marriages in the 17th century. They don't have any children, so she's not dealing with any issues around being a mother and having to balance her household duties with her drive for education. She is obviously very well off, so she's not needing to work at the time. Now, this is different because many writers who were publishing because they needed money, and there is sometimes a stigma attached to that, and women very rarely turn to text to try to raise money. It was seen as below them, but also kind of I would say self-promoting and not modest enough. But sometimes there's also writing about women who published being like, if you're loose with your tongue, you're loose with your body. Like there were also like sexual kind of prostitution angles with it. So women very rarely published their works at this time. She did. She's also, we'll talk about this later, but she becomes the first woman to be invited to the Royal Society, a place that was all men. So she's a really interesting woman. And her publications, not only did she publish, but I mean, she was prolific and published in just about any genre you can imagine. She published poetry, fiction, autobiography, biography. She wrote one of her husband, plays, philosophy, letters. The Blazing World is taught today. I mentioned this is a utopian fiction that was attached to observations on experimental philosophy. And some people see it as one of the first works of science fiction, which is really, really interesting book. Now, to kind of give you a sense of who we're talking about, she published an autobiography of herself at the age of only 33. Now, it's rare for anyone to publish an autobiography of themselves, I think, that young, but especially a 17th century woman. So this gives a sense of her very bold personality and her disregard for social conventions. Like I said, her husband encouraged this writing, and I think that he probably contributed behind the scenes to some of her published works. In fact, she gets called out for that at points as well. But she's very, very interested in the new science that is developing around her, in natural philosophy and chemistry, and she's really interested in matter. And this is one of the big things that comes out, of course, at this time is the microscope. It's a new instrument, and people see the world in a completely different way for the first time in their lives. And I have Hooke's micrographia here, the most perhaps important and significant representation of what the world looked like for people at this time. But I couple this with the Duchess of Newcastle's poem on this, which is in one of her collections. And I'll read to you from the bottom here. For creatures small as atoms may be there, if every one a creature's figure bear. If atoms four a world can make, then see what several worlds might in an earring be. For millions of those atoms may be in the head of one small little single pin. And if thus small, then ladies may well wear a world of worlds as pendants in each ear. And I quite like this poem. I think it's a feminine representation of new developments in science. It's an understanding of, the fact that something as small as if something as small as a pin, like we see here in Hooke, can have so many small little atoms, like something as tiny as that. How many worlds do we hold in our earrings as women? And just understanding herself and how these changes make her think differently about the world around her. So she's definitely engaging with new developments in the field. But again, the fact that she printed this led her to get attacked at the time. And I have a quote here from a contemporary. So this is Lady Damaris Marsham, who John Locke, the great philosopher, who's also in these same circles. He knows Robert Boyle very well and is an executor of his will. He has long correspondences with Lady Marsham about a variety of other things. This is another contemporary philosopher at the time. And we actually see, she makes a comment about how she can't go into print. Locke is encouraging her, maybe you should print some of your own philosophy. And she says to him, well, perhaps you may see me in print in a little while, and then need not be beholden to me, if being grown much the fashion of late for our sex, though I confess it has not much of my approbation, because principally the mode is for one to die first. And at this time, if I might have my own choice, I have no great inclination that way. I think it's a great quote because, basically she's talking about posthumous publications. Women didn't, Margaret Cavendish is extremely rare in that she published during her time. Most women used letter writing to discuss things with each other. And if they were to publish, it would be anonymous, or it would be posthumously after they die. So these were the modes typically available. But as we've said, this exchange between Lady Marsham and John Locke talks about social norms for women. So if we're talking about a woman like Margaret Cavendish, who was so bold and prolific, what kind of a personality did you have to have? What kind of a person were you that you could go about and publish about science and engage and be as bold as that? We get hints of this in the letters and diaries of those who knew her. And I have here, of course, Samuel Pepys, who recorded mid-century London so accurately here. His diaries from 1667 are filled with comments about him running around the city trying to spot the Duchess of Newcastle, and it's very funny. And I have just one comment here from him to just give you a sense of what we're talking about. I back to London, and in the way met my Lady Newcastle, going with her coaches and footmen all in velvet, herself, whom I never saw before, as I have heard her often described, for all the town talk is nowadays of her extravagancies, with her velvet cap, her hair about her ears, many black patches because of pimples about her mouth, naked-necked, without anything about it, and a black jouacourt. And so this idea that the black patches, by the way, and the pimples, this is a French fashion. She was in exile for a bit and then comes back after the restoration of the monarchy. The French fashion was for covering pockmarks. It might be like a black star or just like a really big black fake birthmark. But this gives you like people in that was not the fashion at the time. So she's very much, she's bold. People are running around. She's the talk of the town, in the way that we have our celebrities today that everyone's trying to spot and, you know, figure out what they're on about. The celebrity gossip was around the Duchess of Newcastle. So she indicated that she wanted to be invited to the Royal Society. This is after she's written a series of publications. Some men took her seriously. One of those was Dr. Walter Charlton, who was himself a fellow of the Royal Society. Many, like Boyle and others, did not take her seriously and just did not respond to any of her works. But Dr. Walter Charlton gets an invitation extended to her so that she can visit the Royal Society. And we have here a comment. This is actually from the Journal Book of the Royal Society here, May 30th, 1667, when the Duchess of Newcastle did come. Down here you can see this, the Duchess of Newcastle coming in, the experiments appointed were made. She watched Boyle's experiments with the air pump. She saw some chemical mixtures, magnets, and this was followed by a demo of the microscope. And the work that we see on this now is that she presented herself as though she were a queen at a pageant. There was grandeur and spectacle. She arrived late. She had all her crowd behind her coming in, and people, she said she comes in and they did this demonstration, and afterwards she was kind of condescending and said she was full of admiration, all admiration, but she asked no educated questions, is what I've heard or what I've seen in some of the evidence here. And so it's debatable how that went down. Historians have different opinions about what happened at that particular meeting and what it means about Margaret Cavendish. But what we do know is that they never invited her again. They never nominated her to join the Royal Society. And they later reached out to her to ask for patronage for a building fund in 1668, and she declined. But she continued to be involved in science and was actually quite critical of the experimental philosophy that the fellows of the Royal Society engaged in. She loved science and was very interested in learning about the natural world, but she was much more interested in the theory of science and did not trust the experimental philosophy that was being produced in the Royal Society. And some of this, when she dies, her eulogy is written by Thomas Sprat, who of course also wrote the History of the Royal Society of London. So this shows you again that she's in these circles, and his eulogy is actually, as you would expect for any eulogy, it is flattering, and it is it's very laudatory, as you would expect. But you can see here his comment, she could a reason for each cause present, not trusting wholly to experiment. No principles from others she purloined, but wisely practiced she what speculation joined. She's much more interested in, again, these theories and speculations and debates, and less interested in accepting the experiments that were being conducted by the Royal Society. So this is even mentioned in her eulogy. So that is one way that a woman could get involved in science at the time. She could be a very bold personality, not care what other people think. She can completely disregard social norms, and she could put herself out there and do it. And that is absolutely one way that a woman could do it. Another way that I think was probably more typical, and that we don't know enough about because it's hard to find the evidence, is the route that Catherine Jones, the Viscountess of Ranelagh, pursued. As I mentioned, she is Boyle's older sister, and we have seen for centuries, there's been references to historians saying, we know that Ranelagh was an important part of her brother's intellectual life, but it's been extremely difficult to tell that story. And I will tell you a little bit more about why it's as hard as it was. So she is, in some ways, again, there's some similarities between the two of them. She also had a modest childhood education. While Robert Boyle was sent to Eton College, she had a grand tour of the continent. He was, educated in multiple languages. She does not have that. She's very young when she's 9.5 when she's sent to her first engagement in England, and she gets some education there. And that is typical of the Boyle women in general, is that they were educated in the families of their marriage arrangements. And when you look at the Boyle girls, they are educated so wildly differently because it basically depends on what kind of education they got when they were married off as an age as young as 9. That arrangement doesn't work out. She ends up returning to the Boyle family home, living with the Earl of Cork, and eventually gets married to Arthur Jones, who becomes the first Viscount of Ranelagh. But he is a terrible husband by all accounts, and they separate pretty early on, and divorce is very difficult at this time, and so was separation. But she leaves him in England and takes their 4 children and moves to London and builds a new life for herself there. It is she's there first when her brother eventually comes back to England, and he goes to Stalbridge and then Oxford, and the two of them have a very loving relationship, and there's a ton of correspondence between the two of them during these couple decades when they shared a country but not a house. But then in 1668, he does eventually move into her London home. She builds a laboratory for him, and all these stories you hear about Boyle and his household experiments, that all took place in Ranelagh's house. And we know very little in some ways about what happened there and how involved she was, because unlike Margaret Cavendish, she never published under her own name. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we figure out who she was and how she was, how involved she was at this time. Now, Ranelagh's most intimate group was actually the Hartlib Circle, and this is a forerunner to the Royal Society that is founded in 1660. But unlike the Royal Society, it's a self-selecting group of individuals that do not have a formal membership. So Hartlib employed scribes and served as a hub, and he copied and disseminated useful information across Europe and into the American colonies. And what you see here on the bottom right is a heat map. You can see that it's mostly red around London, but it spreads out, and there's also the American colonies and other places. But it's a very active group for almost 20 years. And the archives are still at the University of Sheffield Library, but they have been digitized and transcribed, and I have the link there where they're available if you're interested. Now, Ranelagh is actually a very big part of this circle, and depending on some recent research that historians have done, she's, by many accounts in network analyses, she's in like the top 10 in how much she was involved in absolutely everything. And when I say everything, I mean she initiated dialogues about political structures that suggested limiting the power of the monarchy. She advocated a proposal to decimalize the English currency over 300 years before it actually was accomplished. There's about 200 mentions of her, but her name is spelled about 20 different ways. And sometimes it's just my lady, and you need to understand the larger context or have a letter beforehand that referenced her to know, oh, we're still talking about Ranelagh here. So it's extremely difficult to pull the whole story together and time consuming. But in addition, the Hartlib papers show, and it's not just the Hartlib papers, but there's letters scattered all around the world on her, is what her interests were over this decade leading up to the Royal Society's foundation. So she was exchanging chemical recipes and trials in English and Latin. This is one example of that. She's sometimes the only woman in a circle who actually was writing with a bunch of men, and they would send her something and say that they want her opinion on something. She wrote chemical testimonies and witness accounts of metal transmutations when people were trying to figure out is this real or not? The one you see here is an account of a famous Irishman called Dr. Butler, and this circulated to John Winthrop Jr. in the American colonies a full year after it was written. It exists in a couple of different copies, so we know that it was taken as a very serious account when everyone was trying to figure out if this Dr. Butler was someone we should pay attention to or not. Ranelagh's voice in this was an important one. She also tested early microscope models when they were introduced to the market. So it's actually, when looking at the materials, it's difficult to say whether Robert Boyle or Lady Ranelagh were interested in chemistry first. The letters that were exchanged between the siblings show that they both became interested in the mid-1650s. Lady Ranelagh actually helps him establish his first 3 home laboratories. When he moves to Stalbridge, she ships chemical equipment to the family estate. When he's going to Oxford, she goes there first. She visits and looks at the bedrooms. She meets with the apothecaries and tries to figure out if there's going to be a suitable space for him to actually have a place for experimentation, but also intellectual stimulation. So she's very involved in her brother's experimental well-being as well. So we look at letters, and the letters are a really important way of finding what Lady Ranelagh was up to, because she wasn't going to publish. She was going to keep everything in a handwritten document. But she also, after the founding of the Royal Society, continues to work on this. It does not stop just because 1660 comes around and Boyle joins the Royal Society. This idea that the door was closed on her is just not accurate. She does continue to work on a variety of natural philosophy topics, and she continues to comment on drafts of Boyle's works before they're even printed. I go into that in more detail in my book, but there's a lot of references to him sending her materials and her commenting on them and returning. One specifically, she talks about how he's going to dispel Aristotle's philosophy, and she really advocates for the new experimental philosophy replacing ancient philosophies of chemistry at the time. So we know she's doing this, and Boyle here does acknowledge her in the preface to Occasional Reflections upon Several Subjects. Sophronia here, he says, "My dearest sister," that is Lady Ranelagh, and historians agree across the board that that is her. And he mentions her, and actually some of the people in his field mention her, call her Sophronia too in some of their letters. Now, there's a comment here where he says, Boyle comments and says, "If her modesty did less confine her pen to excellent letters, she could make the wits of our sex envy a writer of hers." And I think that is, he calls her, and here it's a great mistress of wit and eloquence. Here it is, confine her pen to excellent letters. So what he's saying in this, again, is her choice to follow social conventions at this time. Unlike Margaret Cavendish, who is publishing her work and printing it, Ranelagh is much more modest about her writing. And this is why not everybody knows how intelligent and articulate and witty and eloquent she actually is. But once Boyle moves into Ranelagh's house in 1668, we have some of these references like the preface, but increasingly there's less information about what they did together. And that is because saved correspondence, specifically the correspondence that men saved of hers, and Lady Ranelagh does not have her own archive. It's the archives of men where we can find references to her. We get less of that when Boyle moves in because, of course, they no longer need to write to each other. There used to be letters where they would write and they would ask each other to ship lemons or different materials to each other. You don't need that anymore because they're living together. Of course, they could have that conversation over dinner, and they often did. We know from Hooke's diary that when he went to dine with Boyle, he also dined with Ranelagh. So we know that a lot of those conversations took place orally, and so we lose some of the evidence as historians. But we can dig around a little bit and find references. Some of them are still hidden in Boyle's works, and you can find them if you know where to look. So one example of this is Usefulness of Natural Philosophy. There are several mentions of Lady Ranelagh, but she's never mentioned by name. This book is written to Pyrophilus, which is Ranelagh's son, and throughout it, Boyle is trying to instill some of his mother's characteristics in the son. And so what we see is there's several mentions of her. I'll put both of these up here. There's several mentions of Lady Ranelagh in this, but you have to know that that's what it is because it's never her by name. And so one example here is the ens veneris recipe, which is explained in detail on the right here. This is the essence of Venus, with Venus being copper. It was one of 3 of Boyle's prized chemical recipes that he was very proud of. It's a copper compound that was used to treat rickets. And there's multiple references throughout Usefulness of Natural Philosophy where he mentions working on it with Lady Ranelagh, and but he never says her name. It's always references to we, and the doses, he says here, the doses of ens veneris may be very much varied. To little children, we give sometimes 1, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 grains for many nights together, as we find them able without convenience to bear their operation. Here we is Boyle and Ranelagh, and we know this because there are several references to the ens veneris at other points in this book where he says, Pyrophilus, a woman that you know very well, has done this, this, and this, or Pyrophilus, a woman who is close to us. And so there's always references to Lady Ranelagh working on this. And we know from contextual evidence that she was very passionate about treating the rickets. Boyle says she's treated hundreds of children of that disabling disease. So we know that this was something that they worked on together. And this is one example of it too, where we have here, you, Pyrophilus, and I know a great lady who, though very neat and curious in her health, has worked on this. So these are the kinds of references that we see coming up that we can backtrack, and we know from contextual evidence that it is Lady Ranelagh. Another way that we know that she was working with that she was very much respected at her time by the men in her field is because she was a very active medical practitioner across the 1660s and up until she died in 1691. So you see letters and recipes. She had letters and recipes. There were in-person visits. This is a copy of her medical recipe book on the left, and it's in the British Library, and it has chemical cipher in it. The typical ciphers you'd find other places, like an upside down triangle for water, planetary symbols for the metals. But it's way more sophisticated than women's recipe books at this time. But on the right, we have some of the patients that she treated. And these patients we know of because of letter exchanges, either with her or with her older brother, Lord Richard Burlington. And sometimes they're about politics and family matters, but then they also reflect on her medical practice. Something she was involved in autopsies. I don't know that she witnessed the dissection of a brain with Thomas Willis, but she was in conversations with him about it. When Lady Clarendon's very sick, she gets a letter in the middle of the night to wake her to go to the Earl of Clarendon's house to treat her. And we know that she received gifts for treatments from Penn's children here in Pennsylvania, actually, that were sent back from the colonies back to England. The letters also show that she disagreed with the doctors, and sometimes when the doctors gave up on patients, she gave additional treatments and provided pain relief when they were considered beyond help. So she was very respected and called in to really assist at that time. So who was she? I've mentioned that Margaret Cavendish was kind of seen as a curiosity and maybe got some critiques and wasn't taken as seriously. When we look at how Lady Ranelagh was treated by her contemporaries, it's extremely differently, actually. It's very hard to find any critiques of her in the archives. The back left, we have Gilbert Burnet, who gave the funeral eulogy for Boyle. And of course, like any eulogy, it's laudatory, but I think it's worth noting. He says, she lived the longest on the publicest scene, and she made the greatest figure in all the revolutions of the kingdoms for above 50 years of any woman of our age. And he concluded, such a sister became such a brother. So I like the idea that she was very public, despite the fact that she didn't print, despite the fact that it may not be public in the way that we think of it today. It was considered a very public and bold reputation for that time. And that such a sister became such a brother, that she really helped Boyle become the man he was. John Evelyn, fellow of the Royal Society, see on the back right there, he called her a person of extraordinary talents. Henry Oldenburg, bottom left there, first secretary of the Royal Society and a tutor to Ranelagh's son, says that she was very noble and pious, and he actually had his mail sent to her address. They were neighbors well before Boyle moved into London. In the bottom right there is John Milton, author of Paradise Lost, another tutor to her son, also thought very highly of her. And he comments a couple of times in writing to Pyrophilus, or Ranelagh's son, that how much he's going to miss her when she ends up leaving. So there's a strong relationship there as well, and a mutual respect. And he is not someone, Milton, you may know, is not someone who speaks highly of many women. So there's definitely an intellectual respect there. It was honestly fair to say that everyone who knew her loved her during this time. She was very public. So it's interesting to think that while everyone knew her at this time, why is it that no one knows about her today? And why, when you think of the history of science, is she not one of the people that's there? And it's because she doesn't really fit so nicely into, she does fit very neatly into some of the mainstream narratives, but her reputation was lost almost immediately after her death. And that is because women at this time did not have their archives. So someone like the Duchess of Newcastle, we know about because she did leave a bunch of information behind so we could tell that story. That is not a life that Lady Ranelagh would have chosen for herself. And so you might ask, did Lady Ranelagh and the Duchess of Newcastle like each other? There's no comments on Newcastle's opinion of Ranelagh, but we do know that Ranelagh did not think highly of Newcastle. She says here in a letter to her brother, "By all the characters I hear given her, I am resolved that she escapes Bedlam only by being too rich to be sent there. But she is mad enough to convey the title of that place of her residence, whose boldness and profaneness is allowed to pass for wit." So Ranelagh is not impressed by her wit. We have no references. She, of course, lived with Boyle at this time, so they probably talked about her over the dinner tables, but we don't know what Boyle thought either. Because the reality is Ranelagh was following the conventions for a woman at her time. And so she, like other scholars, here's a quote from Anna Maria von Sherman, another woman who was active in philosophy at the time, says that women scholars were soon enveloped by a useless obscurity upon their deaths. The memorials to women's names are not more in evidence than the traces left by a ship crossing the ocean. When Boyle and Ranelagh both died in December of 1691, the funeral elegy praised both Boyle and Ranelagh in the same one. And again, she was known to everyone. She made the greatest influence of any woman of her generation. But as we see here, women did not preserve their legacies. We have Boyle had literary executors to his will. He preserved his papers at the Royal Society. Ranelagh did not. And so we lose evidence of that almost immediately afterwards. To tell this story, I had to bounce around. You can see here some of the archives, but really the archives of women survive today by being based in the archives of men who saved those collections for them. This is very different from telling the story of someone like Robert Boyle, whose archives primarily are in the Royal Society, but also in other places. But we also have edited collections, thanks to the great work of Michael Hunter and Lawrence Principe and others who were able to put that together. Ranelagh's stuff is difficult for all of the reasons that I mentioned to you today. So I'm just wrapping up on the, so where were women in the history? Where were women in chemistry in the 1600s? To kind of come back to my original question to you, what I would conclude by saying is that they were everywhere. They were on the left here, we have an example, they were in the practical applications of chemistry, but on the right-hand side, they were also in the theoretical aspects as well. It was a much more challenging atmosphere to get involved in that because you either had to have a network or be bold enough to put yourself out there in the ways that we did. So I'll conclude with that. I think we have about 10 minutes, but I'll thank everybody for listening, and I would encourage you to check out some of the free resources that we have on the Science History Institute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for an excellent talk on what is truly far too little studied a subject. And I hope that this kind of contribution, and your book, of course, and all your research will help to encourage more people to look into the role of chemistry, the role of women in chemistry in this period and indeed other periods. We only have one question so far, and that comes from me. And that is, you talked about Lady Ranelagh helping Robert Boyle, with his laboratory. Was the location of his laboratory in Maiden Lane have anything to do with her?
That's a great question. I don't know that No, I don't know that we do. I know that the one that was based on the house, we know that she worked with Hook to come up with the specs for that one and to build that out. I don't know about the Maiden Lane one, and I'm not sure about that one, and I can look into that. I mean, I could email with Michael Hunter about it, I suppose, as well, but I don't know about that one. It's a good question.
Well, of course, as you may know, the laboratory of Maiden Lane is now the Catholic Church of Corpus Christi.
Yeah.
And I want to Jim Marshall from the University of Texas there, because of course he's interested in all the sites where
That makes
elements were
sense.
first made in the UK phosphorus. And he claimed to be able to see aspects of a laboratory in the church, but I'm not convinced about that. But he said you could see there were various aspects of the church, which in his view reflected Bold laboratory. But anyway, there's a very good restaurant opposite called Rules that I often go to. Not cheap, but very good.
Right,
Okay,
right.
well, thank you very much. We haven't had any more questions, I'm afraid, but that was an absolutely fascinating talk. And I would just, forgive me for saying this, thank you very much again. I'm going to ask Ernst Homburg, who's here, to talk about a sort of parallel case, if I may put it that way, in the Netherlands. So I would just allow Ernst to come in here, and in the meantime, our chair, but just before I do that, I will, all these sort of things are coming up. I will just try to share my screen, and oh dear, no, wait a minute, I have to maybe open it up first. Hold on, Ernst, I'm getting the ready. Right, okay, so go back in now. Hope I can share the screen. Thing keeps coming up, so I can't get to my screen. Right, here we are. Right, so this is the does everybody see that okay? Now I will unmute Ernst and ask him to talk about it. Ernst, are you there? I will also allow you to appear.
Yes, I'm there, yes. Can you hear me, Peter?
Ernst. Yes, I can hear you fine, Ernst. Could you tell us about this plaque and the connection to the talk we've just heard? Because you thought it would be a useful contribution. Ernst, are you okay there? I seem to have lost you again. I heard him, but Ernst, are you there?
Yes, my audio was stopped, Peter. That's
Okay.
the point.
Okay, right.
No, well,
Far
thank
away,
you very
far away.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, and can you see the plaque?
Yes, I see it. Yes, of course. Yes. Well, thank you very much, Michelle, for your very inspiring and nice talk. Before your talk, I sent this plaque to Peter. But I think the connection between this and your talk is quite small, in the sense that you talked about two ladies who really were from upper class. And in the beginning of your talk, you said, well, of course, there were also ladies doing artisanal work, like the cookery. And this plaque is about Sylvius and Boerhaven, their house in Leiden, where in the laboratory of Sylvius, two ladies were working, and they were producing medicines. So it's not like the two cases you talked about, because in your case, there was a lot of philosophical debate going on about these two sisters, Catherine and Joanna Agache. And we only know that they were helping Sylvius in the laboratory to produce medicine. So this is a little bit a different situation, but nevertheless, it's very interesting to see that in the 17th century, many women were practically active in chemistry as well. That's what about I would like to add to this.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. That's a very useful contribution, and I'll stop the share. And I would just simply now say, next month we don't have a talk like this because it's Christmas, and I don't think anybody wants to listen to this over Christmas, however good it is. By the way, this is a record-breaking webinar because we got 41 people, at least 41 people, which is a record for this particular series of talks. Anyway, in January we're going to have an absolutely wonderful talk because we've got Philip Ball, that's a famous soundwriter, to talk to us about Paracelsus, the absolutely crucial astrochemist in the 16th century, who was also, of course, extremely controversial and I believe drunk most of the time as well. But that's true of a lot of chemists, isn't it? Anyway, so Philip Ball will be talking to us about Paracelsus, about whom he's written a book, if you want to look it up beforehand, and he'll be talking to us in January. So please do come to that talk, because it's a great honour for us, in a sense, to have him talking to us, just like it's a great honour to have Michelle talking to us today. Next month, however, in our main slot on the third Tuesday of the month, I will be talking about the chemistry of Christmas. Now, when I started on this a few days ago, I thought it was going to be really difficult, but I have been able to pull together some interesting stuff. And I will not be recording it because it's going to involve quite a lot of stuff from YouTube, and I believe that YouTube can block you if you copy other YouTube videos. So this will not be recorded. So if you want to hear this talk about chemistry and Christmas, you've got to come to it. And it will be on the 20th of December at the usual time of 2 p.m. Next month also, and that's something else, but somewhat overlap with this talk. On January, in our main slot, Anna Marie Luz will be talking about Newton and the apothecary. I don't know the full details of what she's talking about, but apparently she found this apothecary who had very close connection to Newton. So in some respects, it does overlap with what we've been talking about today. So once again, please make the effort to come and join us. So once again, thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you very much for everybody for coming. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day, longer in some cases than in others. And goodbye for now, everybody. I'm just about to close down, and that's the end.